by the former Deputy Prime Minister, Michael McCormack, who was there in the government at the time a lot of these moves were made, as detailed in the book, Plagued. Were you aware of the decisions that the then Prime Minister made about taking on those other jobs?
You mentioned the book, Kieran, and a lot of this is about selling the book by Simon Benson and Jeff Chambers. I appreciate that. We can't place an August 2022 lens over what was happening in March and May between that very critical period in 2020. We were worried about bodies piling up. We were worried very much about morgues being filled with dead Australians. I can remember I had Andrew Pinder from the Australian Funeral Directors Association on speed dial. That was the context by which the Prime Minister, the National Security Committee and people such as Greg Hunt and others made decisions for and on behalf of keeping Australians safe. And, you know, I get that the authors want to sell their book. I understand that there are people close to the authors who also want the book to be sold. But that's what we were confronted with at that time. I mean, when we had a dozen cases, not deaths in Australia, each day. I mean, people were panicking, people were worried, people were fraught with fear, and decisions were being taken in long meetings around that national security table in the best interests of keeping Australians alive, in the best interests of keeping Australians in a job.
So, OK, we take that for those first decisions and say everyone supports that. What about a year later, when the Prime Minister took on several other portfolios, including the Treasury portfolio and Home Affairs and Resources? Why is all that necessary?
Well, at the time, many ministers were trying to keep themselves well, of course. Everybody was wearing masks. Everybody was doing the social distancing, doing things that Australians had never been called on to do. And the Prime Minister, obviously worried that some ministers might come down ill, needed to ensure that good government continued, needed to ensure that continuity remained in government, in decision-making. Of course, you would recall that Parliament wasn't sitting as often as it could. And, of course, it was very difficult to even have... we were having unprecedented telepresence meetings and, we were worried that we couldn't always dial a minister in because of various security concerns, etc. And so we needed to have those key decision-makers in a very tight and confined area to make sure that good government continued, to make sure that lives were maintained.
But why didn't the Prime Minister tell others?
Well, that's a matter for the Prime Minister. I appreciate that the Prime Minister has come out with a post today.
The former Prime Minister, but he didn't tell Josh Frydenberg, he didn't tell Matthias Cormann, he didn't tell Karen Andrews. And
I appreciate he's apologised for that today in a long Facebook post. I appreciate that he said things happened that perhaps in the cold light of day should not have happened. But at the time, there were a lot of moving parts. The critical factor was that we were keeping Australians alive. And people need to remember that. And they need to remember that Australia was doing very well compared to the rest of the world. I can remember the confrontation of seeing those open graves being dug on Manhattan Island in New York, where people were just being heaved in. This was an extraordinary time, and we had to make extraordinary decisions.
So you knew about all the moves as they happened, did you?
Well, I knew of the fact that he was going to fill in for Greg Hunt, and Greg Hunt was, as I recall, au fait with that.
What about the other moves, the finance minister?
Like I say, there were a lot of moving parts. No, I wasn't aware of everything.
Keith Pitt, Resources Minister?
Well, he said that he was going to make a decision as the Prime Minister on that particular offshore gas decision. Now, rightly or wrongly, I mean, these people who were probably going to be very against that need to remember too that the state government has, as I understand, sat on their hands about this for 12 months. They probably wouldn't have okayed it at any rate, but those people who would have been upset about some offshore exploration will now probably get their renewable nirvana with Chris Bowen putting wind turbines off the coast.
But did you know that he'd become Resources Minister, effectively, alongside Keith?
I knew he was going to make a decision on that. And as I said to Keith at the time, well, Keith wasn't agreeable with the decision that he was going to take. But at the end of the day, he is the Prime Minister. And so we'd had a discussion quite a long discussion, an earnest discussion about the actual gas, about the situation, about what the state government would have done or what might not have done in relation to that. Keith wasn't entirely happy with that decision, but at the end of the day, we also wanted to remain in government because we were fearful.
Fearful. I interrupted.
Well, we were fearful about where COVID was going to go. We were fearful about even more deaths.
Were you fearful of losing those seats, though? Is that what that PEP 11?
Well, of course, I think any government would be fearful of losing seats to a decision being taken at the time, which the state government was never going to probably approve of anyway. And so, why cost yourself an own goal when the state government had been considering this decision, had not made a final outcome on it, as I recall, and probably wasn't going to make the decision that was going to be the same as the government's at any rate.
So, do you see why the Prime Minister and others are looking at this and going, Scott Morrison was obviously going too far here with these calls, given you've talked about the pandemic, yes, and I think a lot of people would have sympathy for that. But when you go to a resources project, and the Prime Minister's just said, OK, I
understand that, Kieran.
I don't support that. I'm going to become the minister and overrule that. Isn't that?
I understand that, but nobody's
talking
about this around the kitchen tables of Australia. Nobody is talking about this at the ag shows or the sale yards or the coffee carts or the water coolers in offices around metropolitan and regional and rural and indeed remote Australia at the moment. Nobody. This is selling a book. Good luck to, I think the book's being launched on Thursday. There you go, I've given it a plug. It's really inside the beltway stuff. The Prime Minister made extraordinary decisions for an extraordinary time.
We heard a constitutional expert just George Williams saying how it potentially undermines our Westminster system by having a Prime Minister stepping on to the responsibilities of other
and I've seen
ministers.
Other constitutional experts give the opposite view. So if you're not happy with one constitutional expert, ask another one, you might get a different view. It's one of those situations where, and I appreciate Professor Williams' expertise in this field, he's got more expertise than you and I will ever have. But again, it's his view. Again, we made extraordinary decisions at an extraordinary juncture.
But that's not to do with the pandemic.
Political life.
The gas project's not.
I appreciate that. We parked that to the side. The other ones were. The other ones were definitely made in the best interests of keeping Australians alive, and I get that this was an unprecedented time. Australia hadn't confronted a situation like this since, well, basically World War II, and I'm sure that John Curtin, when he was sitting around the War Cabinet in Gundagai, dare I say, in Niagara Cafe in 1942, was probably making decisions which weren't going to be exposed by the Daily Telegraph or the radio at the time, the big news sources. He made decisions to keep Australians safe.
So in hindsight, should Scott Morrison have stayed just simply with those pandemic responses for these extra powers he granted himself and not extend that into other areas like resources?
Well, irrespective of the resources decision, in hindsight, Australia did very well. The John Hopkins Research Institute said that of all the nations in the world, we were ranked number 2 with our pandemic response and with our pandemic outcomes. We kept Australians alive. We kept Australians safe. We kept Australians in livelihoods. And I think if there's any key factor, as even Jim Chalmers said himself, we will be judged on keeping people in work. And certainly I know Australians will judge us on the health outcomes that we achieved, and that was very, very good.
The other fundamental criticism of all this has been the lack of transparency. If the then Prime Minister thought it was crucial, why didn't he tell everyone, including not your own colleagues, but the Australian people?
Well, there's a lot of moving parts, as I say. I mean, there were a lot of decisions taken around that national security table, around the few who, and I can remember sitting in those meetings, the initial meetings, when it was looked as though we were going to lose 40 to 50,000 Australians. The looks on the Chief of Defence face, the Chief Health Officer, Greg Hunt, Maurice Payne, I can remember the looks of fraught panic that we, Josh Frydenberg, and we did what we needed to do to keep people in jobs, but more importantly, to keep people alive.
So this wasn't Scott Morrison captured by the power of Prime Minister?
No.
And taking it to a whole new level?
Not at all, Kieran.
You disagree with that assessment?
Look, he did what he needed to do as Prime Minister. He took on extraordinary powers. I mean, he said himself, the workload We were working 16-hour days every day, meeting. I mean, you do anyway as the Deputy Prime Minister, as the Prime Minister. That's basically the time. But we were working around the clock to make sure that Australians were safe. We were working around the clock to make sure that we didn't have bodies piling up. I mean, that was the situation that we were confronted with. And I've got to say, this book, this whole scenario is not being talked around the kitchen table. They are worried about cost of living in August 2022. They're not worried about decisions that the Prime Minister took for and on their behalf to keep them safe back in March or May 2020.
What do you say to David Littleproud, who described this as pretty ordinary? Barnaby Joyce, who says it's not a presidential system?
Well, they weren't in those meetings. They weren't in those meetings confronted with what we were being told by a Chief Medical Officer, what we were being, what the images that we were seeing. Obviously, that was privy. Everybody across Australia were privy to that. But I think the stark reality of the intel that we were getting about the number of deaths that this could cause, we needed to work and act fast. I mean, you heard Peter Dutton himself say that he was hospitalised. He had 27 or 8 days in isolation. I mean, these were extraordinary times. And people were worried about 1 or 2 cases of COVID coming into Australia, let alone, you know, the death rate now is much higher than the case rates were back then when the panic across Australia, we needed to calm, we needed to make sure that the right decisions were being taken.
But we go back to that point that I made earlier to you, and that is, fine, the original decisions, maybe people can see that, but the subsequent decisions, a year later, many months after the start of the pandemic, and yet the Prime Minister of the day taking more and more responsibility from other ministers.
Well, look, I understand.
That's why people are asking.
I understand the gas decision. You know, can be debated, and I'm sure that when Parliament resumes on September 5, I'm sure it'll be front and centre of what will be discussed. But there was a decision taken, not agreed to by the minister. He was concerned about it. But let me tell you too, the state government had not reached an outcome on this and had 12 months to do so, as I recall. And you know, we were looking at a situation where we had an election looming, and we didn't want to ensure that all of those people along the central coast and the eastern coast of Australia were concerned about something that may not have happened or may not have arisen at any rate. Why would you kick an own goal like that? And at the end of the day, they're probably going to get wind turbines off the coast anyway. Some of them might be happy because that's the way they voted. And
you disagree with Karen Andrews that Scott Morrison...
Well, that's a matter for Karen Andrews.
He should quit Parliament.
Well, that'll be a matter for Scott Morrison to decide what his future is. What I need to say is that Scott Morrison made the right decisions at the right time to keep Australians alive.
Former Deputy Prime Minister Michael McCormack, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Kieran.